everyone, I'm Admiral Ellis, and welcome to the Zombie Train. This is episode number 316. We have a question from... who is it from? Let me see real quick. It is from Stephen N., and he asks, I think that you have talked about this in a previous episode, but did you ever use any of the trackage that belongs to commuter lines that run in and out of New York City? Did you use any of the electric rolling stock? And I did reply that I believe I've talked about electric stuff before, and I made sure not to put it in a different episode, or, in the list here, but the long and short of that is that we didn't use much electric stuff until much later, but we do use it today. Not that New York City is a particularly... popular destination these days, because it is still a little bit dangerous. But we definitely run some of the stuff a lot on the outskirts. And if we want to talk about the commuter lines, aside from the Northeast Corridor being included, so I assume you mean things run by the old Long Island and the Metro North, as well as, I guess, CT dot stuff is mixed in there, because Connecticut had their own commuter rail, which I didn't realize until I found the equipment. But, yeah, so we did use a lot of that trackage, although not to shuffle commuters in and out of New York City. We did it when we had to get close, which wasn't often, because of, like I said, dangerous place, even now. Not super dangerous, but before it was... well, you just kind of stayed away. We made sure in a lot of our operations that we did not go too close to New York City. And we were very thankful for the fact that basically everybody was cooped up on an island. The fact that it's connected to the mainland by bridges and tunnels, yeah, there were definitely some zombies that came through, but to my knowledge, the only military presence on the East Coast before they finished basically everywhere else was to monitor New York City. Because they knew that we were out there and other groups of survivors were out there that would have been absolutely, completely overrun if even a fraction of the horde of zombies that occupied New York City got loose. And so I believe there was a concerted effort to keep them on the island, whether that was by basically dropping bombs, which would make a lot of noise and keep them distracted to bring them in, or, I'm certain in a couple of cases they demolished bridges, tunnels, other pieces of infrastructure. I know that the drawbridge at the north end of the island, the one that Amtrak would use when they ran into Penn Station, was opened. But I don't know if it was open before the war started, or if it was something that happened later. I just remember that it was open. It's still open, I'm pretty sure. So, actually, it might have had... I'm not sure if it's still there, actually, now that I mention it. I haven't seen it in many, many years, so I don't think it's there anymore. It might have, sort of fallen into the sea. There have been a lot of pretty major storms that I know battered the hell out of New York City. Nobody was there to do anything about it, but, nobody was there to get hurt, really. But I know from what I've heard from the Navy personnel and other people that have gone in there and come back, of which there are not too many, that there are a lot of areas that are basically completely inundated, which is interesting, right? Because right after the war, right after the Great Panic, in like the year or two or handful after, there was actually, from what I've heard from meteorologists, and I believe the people who were stuck up on the International Space Station, because at least one of them is still alive, they noted that there was actually a global cooling that happened because of the vast, vast amount of pollutants that were ejected to the atmosphere because of hundreds of thousands of families suddenly basically camping. And many of them would not survive for very long, so that wasn't a continued effect. But there was this noticeable dip in global temperature just due to the sheer amount of smoke reflecting sunlight. And they're not doing what you'd expect it to do as a greenhouse gas, but too much of it will just reflect sunlight, especially sulfuric content things, which I know it's, wood is not particularly high in sulfur content, but that's just in particular that. That happened, and the only thing I can think that would sink New York so much is sort of like a sea level rise, because obviously that was a problem before the war. It's still, to an extent, a problem. We just don't have as many people, so we can stay a little bit farther back from the coast. New York being in that sort of difficult position. Obviously, they're not the worst off city on the planet, but nobody really lives there anyway, so nobody really cares. But yeah. So, did we use those lines? To an extent, but not, on purpose. The lines really just sort of took us in a direction that we didn't really want to go. Going along the coast in Connecticut is all well and good, but when you get too close to New York, you start, inviting trouble. More importantly, you run into the Navy guys who are saying, don't go here, you're inviting trouble. And I know there were a few of them basically at any given time. I know there was a significant presence before and around the Battle of Yonkers. They bugged out for a little while. They came back. They did some containment measures, to my understanding. And then they kept a very minor contingent. Again, these were people that were very far from home. We didn't really interact with them because that was before Zombie Train Inc. After Zombie Train Inc., it was half split between ZT crew and Navy personnel that would guard, and pretty much everyone was under our umbrella because, again, they were very far from home. It was easier for us to supply them than it was for anybody else to. So, yeah, I mean, they were out on Long Island, which is particularly difficult to get to on a train if you cannot go through New York City. In other words, you really can't get there. But when we were on Long Island, which we would normally use a boat to get there, if we had to go overland, we would take a diesel that we could get running. Those are probably the most common uses of diesel locomotives during, or rather before the Zombie Train Incorporated by the Zombie Train. And even then, to an extent during the Zombie Train Incorporated, it was mainly diesel power that reigned on Long Island, just because it was so difficult to get anything there. And I don't mention them that often because they really didn't do a whole lot. There were a few survivors out there. Like I said, the Navy contingent was out there, and there were a few survivors. But Long Island being so densely populated was a danger in its own right. Also, you are, in no small part, connected to New York City, and that leads to its own spread of problems, of course, as has been mentioned at length. So, yeah, the suburbs of New York were not much better than New York. And while I can understand why, those heavily trafficked rails, you'd think about, oh yeah, obviously, they get a lot of traffic, we'd need them. But it's really only transporting people, and when the people are all dead, they really don't see much use. We did use one of the cut-across tracks. I think it was like the Beacon subdivision or something. I can't remember what it was called. Back in the CSX days or the Metro North days. I don't know exactly who owned it. But it connected the Housatonic and the Harlem line to the Hudson line. We did use that kind of often because it was one of the easiest ways to get, across that way without going down into New York. If we needed to go and meet up with a ship or with people on the Hudson River, then we would pretty much always do that if they couldn't get all the way up to Albany. Which Albany, we did a fairly good job of keeping Albany locked down while we were, in zombie train mode, just because it meant so much to us. It was not like, oh wow, it meant a lot to us, but it was a really important connection. It was the connection between New England and the rest of the world, effectively, if you didn't want to go via Canada. And I can't understate how important that is, because our base of operations was in New England. Now, whether that was a little bit foolhardy is up for debate, as it kind of always is, because we still operate out of New England in our limited capacity. But it is what it is. It's, this has always been our home base. It is, in the years since the zombie train, it's been built up to handle basically anything that we could need. Not just for the zombie train, but for the Zombie Train Incorporated. That's why, if you could call them our corporate offices, then that's what they are. It's just where we do a lot of the bean counting, the logistics planning stuff. It all really happens here. Back in the day, when things were huge, we had other complexes sort of scattered across the U.S., more or less where we had locomotive servicing. But these days it really isn't as important because we've got fewer locomotives, less stuff to do, and like I've said probably 100 times, we're in the process of moving operations off of the zombie train. If I may disclose, the Navy has offered me a sort of cushy retirement, as it were. Still doing a lot of overseeing with, the various railroads and stuff like that, because I'm not sure there's anybody else who has more experience at this point. But for a lot of us that have been the head of the zombie train for a long time, we either just want to tool around the country in relative ease and luxury, or, retire to a little backwoods estate where nobody will ever bother us. Personally, as long as I can justify the Enterprise no longer being a necessary expense for the Navy, necessary expense, being a necessary tool, then I would love to have basically a giant dirigible to float around the world in, because there are plenty of things that I still haven't seen, and, I would love the opportunity. Most of the time I've been to other countries, it's been on a tight schedule and in danger. So, I am lucky to have the opportunity to again, live a life of relative luxury. And I say relative because it's not the same way it used to be. We don't have, internet and video games, and certainly not to the level that we did back in 2012. But it's, it doesn't feel like the end of the world anymore. And that's something that I rather like. Now, I was concerned this episode that somebody was going to come barging in here. I tend to film these after hours, so to speak, so it's a little side project of mine. I'm not sure too many people that work with us know about them, but I like doing them. It's going to be a chronicle, It's a good way to have a record, and not a written or a visual record, but a record of all these things that happen. You think about it, we lost so many people during the war, and probably billion stories that'll never get told. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this video. This is the Admiral, signing off.